Barry Yeoman, welcome to the podcast.
Mike, thank you for having me.
So, I think most folks in the stuttering community, stuttering world know you already, but for those who don't, what, where do you live? Where you're from originally, and what do you do?
Sure. So first, thank you so much for having me. I am originally from New York, and I have lived my entire adult life or almost my entire adult life in Durham, North Carolina, where I am a freelance journalist. I write mostly for magazines, but I also do a little bit of audio and radio journalism and web-based journalism. And increasingly I'm teaching, and I'm teaching journalism both at Wake Forest University and Duke University.
Those are a couple of great universities. And so how was were you always the sort of, well, none of us are born successful. That comes over time. But were you always as confident and comfortable in your skin as you seem like you are now?
Oh gosh, no, not even close.
So I assume you got some pretty like, I don't know if I've ever met anybody with developmental stuttering. Well, a couple people that did not have really tough childhood surrounding their stutter, but most of us have some challenging memories. Are you in that boat?
I am completely in that boat. You know, I had a slightly later onset of my stutter than a lot of kids. I was 6 or 7. And so there was a time I spoke fluently. And I started stuttering in first or second grade, and not even sure that I had the language to understand that something was changing in how I talked. But my parents recognized it, and they did what virtually any parent in the 1960s would have done, which was they came to me and said, "Do you want to fix your stutter?" And they sent me to a very nice speech therapist who did the only thing he really knew how to do at the time, which was to teach me bouncing and prolonging. And so whenever I felt a block coming on, if it was on a hard sound like a B or a P or a K, I would just b b b b b bounce the word until the sound could come out slowly. And if it was a sound that couldn't be bounced because it wasn't a hard sound, I would prolong it, like, or like that, until the sound could come out. It didn't fix me. It didn't make me stutter less. In fact, if that speech therapist was good for one thing, and he was very good for this, it was teaching me how to deal with the other thing that was happening in my life, which was getting bullied. So like a lot of little kids, I walked in a world of cruel little peers. And by the time I was 9 or 10 years old, I was getting mocked pretty relentlessly for the stutter. And there was one kid in particular, and my speech therapist had this really kind of brilliant idea that I've since shared with other kids, which is that I should pretend that this bully was auditioning to play me in a movie and tell him how good he was at it. And so I was a little skeptical when he suggested this, but I did it. And the guy stopped and said, "Really?" And then the next day he made fun of me again, and I did this again. And there was no third day after that. He wanted to become my friend. And so that was, I would say, the most valuable thing I got out of early speech therapy. And then, the next speech therapist focused more on breath and talking in kind of a Marilyn Monroe breathy voice. It was kind of a precursor to the Martin Schwartz passive airflow, except it wasn't passive. It was like very heavy letting out breath.
And from what I understand, Barry, and I haven't researched this deeply, but I think I might have read it on the Stuttering Foundation website, that Marilyn Monroe's patented voice came from her trying to control it. Like when she talked like sexy Marilyn, she didn't stutter, that sort of
right.
thing.
Yes, I think that's absolutely right.
Which is interesting, right? So her stutter, she might not have been Marilyn Monroe. If she probably wouldn't have been, because I think the voice was a part of her appeal for sure, right? Especially in an era where, you didn't have her on video every single time, like I'm sure there'd be, from what I understand, she did quite a few interviews, that sort of thing. So that voice was really, powerful to captivate America's attention. Now, my imitation is poor, but
it's a lot less captivating on a 14-year-old boy.
Exactly. Well, and it's not, you wanted to talk like you, I would guess, right?
Right. So, so in parallel to all this, there's a couple other things going on in my life. One is that I'm really smart. I'm kind of, a junior whiz at numbers and at writing, and I'm a total failure at anything involving the body. So not only can I talk, but I'm really bad at sports. I can't do a single chin up. I try to play the clarinet in school band and I fail. My parents give me other music lessons, piano and guitar, and I can't do that. I am not quite yet figuring out that I'm gay. And so I'm failing at the normal attractions that a boy is supposed to have. Like everything that we use to measure physical competency, I was failing at. And as you can imagine, this took a toll on my sense of myself. And so even though by high school I had a lot of friends and I was editor of my high school newspaper, there was this other piece of me kind of below that surface, below the surface of success. There was this piece that basically was an ongoing drum beat saying, you have failed at living in your body. That was kind of the overwhelming message that I was giving myself as I went through adolescence, which of course is the moment when we're trying to figure out who we are and we're trying to figure out where our place in the world is, and we're testing what adulthood looks like and all that. I couldn't talk. I couldn't mate. I couldn't throw a basketball. I couldn't play music. And that was a big part of my self-definition back then.
That's super interesting. So you were living sort of this parallel existence. You were, with what you were doing with your knowledge, whether it was the editing of the newspaper or your some of your academic skills, right? Your understanding of things you were learning in school, you were doing real well. And in parallel, you felt like a total failure on everything else. And that's interesting the way you're describing it. like you were a failure when it came to your body. So it sounds like there was a big disconnect between your mind, which felt competent, although obviously the stuttering thing, I would guess, probably felt limited as far as how much you could show your intelligence with other people, or was the stutter not limiting you so much in that sense?
I think I was doing okay in a lot of ways because a lot of how I showed my intelligence was writing. But definitely I knew that there were places where I was hitting limits. You know, in high school English class, one of my teachers just routinely passed me over. Like when we were all reading something out loud, he would just skip over me, and we never talked about it. And he never asked what I wanted. And when I graduated the valedictorian of my Hebrew school, I didn't make the valedictory remarks. The number 2 person made the remarks, and they never asked me. They just did it. So in some ways it was imposed on me.
Did you want to do that, Barry? Did you want to speak? Did you want your teacher to call on you, and did you want to give the speech, or were you relieved that they didn't ask you?
Yes, both. I think in English class I was relieved because reading aloud didn't particularly showcase who I was, and I didn't even realize the speech was a possibility. But I liked being a public figure. That was why I was editor of the school paper. I liked being special. Who doesn't like being special at 16?
And you were getting that affirmation of who you were on that side as you beat yourself up on all these other things simultaneously.
Yeah. Adolescence was complicated.
So was mine. So it's a little different than yours. So from the time I started getting made fun of, I didn't have that super valuable thing that you did learn from that first speech therapist, which was how to deal with the bully. I didn't have that. I had no idea. And the way I dealt with it was to just not speak, not give them ammunition. And I went from not giving a care in the world about my stutter up until the 6th grade to suddenly, well, I liked a girl, another boy liked a girl, and he used the stutter against me by making fun of me in front of other people, trying to make me the laughing stock so, she wouldn't be as interested. And that was the first time. And, that I remember even being aware. My parents told me I stuttered the whole time, but I think it was more like that. They said it was like I had 100 things to tell them. And, I want, like there were too many words at the gate, so to speak. I wanted to tell them everything at once, but that's not how human speech works. So within the time I was made fun of in the 6th grade, within a year, I could barely get a word out. Like as soon as I started trying hard not to stutter, it was hard to get a word out. And so for the next 7 years, I was really severe and completely in my shell. So my dual track story, similar to yours, but we're doing different activities, was my senior year of high school. I'm finally coming into my own as a basketball player. I finally learned to be aggressive. I was always a good shooter, always had the talent, although I was real skinny, but I would not throw my body in there. Like I would hold back, right? And, drove my dad nuts because he knew I wasn't hustling. It's like, if you're not trying your hardest, of course you're not going to do your best, And I would always say, I am hustling, I am trying. Senior year, I don't know if it was, developing into a man's body, testosterone, age, whatever it was, it snapped and I knew how to hustle suddenly. So I'm coming into my own as a basketball player my senior year, one of the top 2 or 3 players on the team. At the same time, that same senior year, neither of my only two friends that I was comfortable talking with and stuttering with happened to be in my lunch period. So rather than just find another table, I literally brought my lunch into the bathroom stall the entire lunch hour, my entire senior year of high school. I hid in the bathroom, sitting in there living in dread that somebody was going to discover, this freak show, as I thought of myself when it came to speaking, hiding in the bathroom every day. And luckily, nobody ever asked neither of my two buddies, the only people I talked to, never asked, what lunch period are you in, Wilson? That never came up, luckily. So nobody ever knew until like a couple of years ago. So I'm sitting in the bathroom smelling other boys, stuff as they come in to use the bathroom, no phones. So I would bring a book. And I remember eating Fritos, lots of Fritos during those lunches, just sitting in there. And meanwhile, I'm walking around school and everybody's like, hey, Mike, good game the other day. And I sort of wave, but not make too much eye contact because I can't talk to them. Right. So I'm totally living this dual life, and nobody knew. My parents, nobody knew until a couple of years ago that I was hiding in the bathroom.
That is such a heartbreaking and poignant, vivid story. My gosh. I can feel the 16-year-old you, and it's really piercing.
And we all know, right? Like you said, you can feel it. You can, even though you didn't experience exactly that, you know exactly where it came from.
Yep.
Right. And only folks that have experienced the iceberg and lived in the iceberg, lived in the deep, dark iceberg, I think can fully feel that. And I think that's why you see so much volunteer work with folks that stutter. I think people like, yourself and me, they're just sort of driven to help people thaw their iceberg if we can. And Barry, I don't even think I know about this. I'm asking you a sort of blind on the on the podcast here, but have you been involved with mentoring folks that stutter over the years?
A little bit. It's been pretty informal, and I think there are probably some young adults who might think of me as a mentor. It's never been a particularly institutionalized process. I teach, and so I've had students who stutter. I certainly have mentored some young adults who are trying to figure out their place in the stuttering world. But as I said, always in kind of an informal way.
Gotcha. And have you found that how many years would you say have you been, has your iceberg been largely thawed? When was a turning point for you from a speech standpoint? And for most of us, it's when we say, look, I got stuff to say and I'm going to say it whether I'm going to stutter or not.
It was when I walked into a room full of people who stutter. So I was 32. And so almost half my life ago. So, I kept on trying to fix my stutter until I was in my late 20s. And those last years of speech therapy were really hard, because not only was I making virtually no progress, I had a little tool of tricks, a bag of tricks, a bag of tools that I could reach into that could get me through a particularly hard moment. But by and large, I was not measuring up to what I thought I should be doing and what my clinicians thought I should be doing. And so I finally quit speech therapy in my late 20s. And lo and behold, my fluency improved almost immediately. And then shortly after that, I was working in a newspaper here in Durham, North Carolina, and with the deadline approaching for the next week's issue, one of the writers fell through, and my editor asked if I would write a column about my stutter, and I did. I've been encouraged to do so for years and had always rebuffed the idea, but I'm a good employee, and we were near a deadline, and there was a hole in the newspaper, and so I dashed off this article in a couple of days, and I got such affirming feedback from not just from other people who stutter, and all this was before email, so it was like letters in the mail, but from people who had other physical disabilities or physical differences, just from people who knew me. It was like a second coming out for me, and it was really gratifying, and that helped some. But it wasn't for another 3 years when I found what was then called the National Stuttering Project, the precursor to the National Stuttering Association, and I went to their conference in San Francisco, that the world just changed for me. Here I was kind of nervously entering this room where I didn't know anybody. I had literally never been in a room with more than one other person who stuttered, and even that very rarely. And here was this room full of people who I really liked. They were funny, and they were affectionate, and they were good looking, and they were welcoming.
They were just as good as your non-stuttering friends, if not better. Right?
Well, yeah. I mean, it was different because I didn't know them as well, but we shared more in common. And this was an international conference. It was the third World Congress of People Who Stutter, and so they were also exotic. You know, there were people from all over the world, and we had this shared experience. And some of those people remained my friends almost 30 years later. The same people I met at that very first gathering. And I've told this story before, but it was such a turning point for me that I love thinking about it. As often happens at meetings of people who stutter, the best stuff happened informally. And there was one night where 8 of us went out to dinner. And this was San Francisco, so food was everywhere. And we walked from the convention center area to the Mission District, which is largely Latinx immigrant. And we went to a Salvadoran restaurant, and there were 8 of us. And there were 2 Americans, including me, and 4 Germans, and 2 Poles, one of whom did not speak very much English. And so one of the other Poles had to translate for her friend. The Germans all spoke fluent English, better than I do. And the server did not speak English very much. And she was so freaked out by these 8 people stuttering that she actually made us prepay our meal, which was fine because we were just so in love with the moment. And we were drinking sangria and eating pupusas and having these conversations about like what it was like being in Berlin when the wall fell, which was only the previous year, I think, or maybe a couple of years earlier. And so that was to me the moment that the first layer of the iceberg just dissolved, and I realized I feel so comfortable, I feel so myself, got nothing to hide, and that kind of launched me.
That's awesome. And I, you know, you're not alone in having a transformative experience when you first start to hang out with other folks who stutter. And I'm trying to put my finger on it, like putting it into words why it's so powerful. And maybe it varies from person to person. Um, but just to think through it. So, one, obviously knowing for a fact that the way you responded and thought about stuttering wasn't so weird after all. It's actually, you know, the normal way that most of us respond to it. Um, Hopefully, seeing somebody there who is older, you know, let's say, or not older, but is successful, even though they still have their stutter and they're still succeeding. Okay, the stutter's not going to stop me. You know, it's not like a death sentence for my career. That and just realizing that people that stutter are actually cool. Like my stuttering friend, you know, I don't know, Juan is not inferior to my non-stuttering friend Pedro, right? It's just one's got a stutter, but that's just one of the things about them. It's not central,
Yeah.
right? And I think that sort of helps melt that idea that we are inferior in some sense because of this speech impediment. We are far less than what we would be if we didn't have the stutter. I think that runs deep in many of us, and to be around others that stutter, that are perfectly cool, perfectly solid human beings, despite their stutter, it's like, wait a second, maybe I've been seeing this wrong.
I think the coolness really is it's important here, um, because we all, or at least our 16-year-old selves, all want to be cool. That is the currency. And stuttering when you're that age, and particularly during the decades when I was 16, the decade when I was 16, stuttering just automatically makes you uncool. And so seeing these cool people, these people who have all the traits that would make someone the popular kid in high school. And because for all of us, our first conference is our first conference, meaning that we are there with people, almost everyone else who is there has more experience thinking about this. We are automatically being mentored. We are automatically being ushered into this world by people who have thought about this longer than we have. And particularly for me, because it was an international convention and there were so many folks from other countries, not many people go to a stuttering conference in another country if they haven't first put in some time in their own country. And so at that table, because 6 of the other 7 people were either German or Polish, all of them had been thinking about this in valuable ways longer than I had. And it's not like they were showing me the ropes in any intentional way. It was just they were being themselves. And that was what was so lovely. And a lot of them were younger than me. So they had found this community much earlier than I had in my life. I was 32 already.
That's a great point. You're almost like you're being exposed quickly to a much more sophisticated way of thinking about stuttering rather than I'm a loser, I need to stop stuttering, I'm a loser, I need to, you know, I mean, you know what I'm saying? And not that you thought you were a loser overall, because you weren't, but when it comes to this stuttering thing, the only thing that matters is getting rid of it and not stuttering, right? When it comes to my speech, and to realize that that's not the most important thing. You know, it's being ourselves and saying what we want and not letting stuttering stop us
Right.
in life.
Yeah. I think it's also worth saying that just like my parents were reflecting 20th century parenting, my first speech therapist and my second speech therapist were reflecting 20th century speech therapy. This first group of people who I stuttered were reflecting 20th century coolness, meaning they were seeing stuttering as not limiting. But that's different from what I think of as 21st century coolness, which is actually seeing stuttering as a value added. And what's been really neat for me over the last 30 years, almost 30 years, but particularly in that period from my first conference to right around 2014, was the rise of this next generation of people who stutter, actually thinking of stuttering as something that makes us better and that makes the world better for our presence in it. And I'm happy to talk about that more either now or later.
Yeah, no, I love that. And, you know, as you're talking, I thought about this some, but it's really crystallizing in my mind. Well, my history, Barry, is until a few years ago, I had a really good stutter going. You know, I like to call it a good stutter, not a bad stutter, as many do. And I found an approach, you know, physically that really agreed with me. And for the first time, I got involved in hanging out with other folks that stutter a lot. Found a particular approach, deep breathing, voice projection, really getting dialed into articulation, deliberate disfluencies. So you'll sometimes see me stretch out sounds like I'm doing right now, or start words and then pause like I'm doing there. And that all happens for a reason, like practicing resisting time pressure, learning to release, all that kind of stuff. But so I ran the experiment. All right. I mean, I'm still totally a person that stutters, the stuttering wolf, as I like to refer to the opponent in this sport of speaking, which I thoroughly enjoy the sport. You know, I like to say, look, a non-stuttering person will never get any joy from being able to say their name at Starbucks. It's a non-event. We can get actually intense joy from these simple little things, right? Like, oh, I nailed my name there. Nice, you know? Yep. So I've run the experiment, right? And I'm a dentist, was fortunate, you know, was able to build up 5 practices, about 220 employees, maybe 30 dentists or so, you know, all with a good stutter going. And so something I noticed. So for those first 10 years of having the dental business, I, you know, had the good stutter. And then I found an approach that really agreed with me. So then, you know, as people see it, largely I don't have it, although I remind them all the time, I'm not cured. This is like staying in shape physically, you know, I still have to work on it every day, you know, because I don't want the performance anxiety, you know, be seen as the cured guy. No thanks. Right. But with interviewing dentists, so for all those years with and I'll model it, I can pretty easily do it. I just hold my breath and try to push the word out with no air. Human speech is impossible with no airflow, of course. When I would talk like that, you know, how I talked, but I also had the perspective, I'm going to say every word I want to say so I went from hiding in the bathroom my senior year. 6 months later at Florida State, a guy named Dr. Richard Ham, who ran this speech pathology department at Florida State. And when my parents dropped me off at Florida State, they stopped and spoke with him for like an hour and just pleaded with him. You know, Doc, our son is just mired in his shell. He's scared of his own shadow when it comes to talking to people. And they forced me to go away to college. I wanted to stay home in the comfort zone. And they pushed the birdie out of the nest and said, you're going 5 out, you know. Went to Florida State. I was a Florida State fan, but yes, that helped. But I was terrified. What Dr. Ham did my whole first semester at Florida State was just bring me around campus and made me talk to people and made me get used to looking them in the eye when I stutter. Face, and I found for me, Barry, within 4 or 5 sessions of that and realizing, wait a second, holy, you know what? People will just sit there and listen. They'll sit there and answer my question, and then we'll both go on with our day like it didn't even happen. Like it's not the end of civilization.
Right.
For you to have to push through a word every now and then. It's really not. Just finish your sentence. Just say what you want. You know, you're not gonna be able to say maybe as much detail, you know, and speak monologues as much because there's only so many hours in the day, perhaps. But and I certainly talk too much sometimes now with the speech powers. Right now I'm doing that, but but anyway, so once I found that icon, like I can say what I want, actually, I went from that to actually raising my hand in crowded lecture halls at Florida State because my 19-year-old self would think, maybe the professor hasn't thought of this. He needs to think of this. You know, I wanted to ask the question and raise my hand and stutter and just look around from person to person in the eye, look at the professor. And I internally developed a perspective. Look, if you have a problem with my stutter, no worries. Go hang out with somebody else. Don't let the door hit you on the rear end as you leave. Right?
Right.
Not that I had to say that to people, you know, and I would forgive people for their, another part of this was to forgive people for their initial you know, like their quick voluntary response before they know you're a person stutters, right? Which people will do. Because when fluent people stutter, when non-stuttering people stutter, it means something, right? It means they don't know what they want to say. It is kind of funny when a non-stuttering person stutters a lot because it means they're really discombobulated, right? But it's not funny when we stutter. And once people know, oh, this guy's got a speech impediment. Okay, now I got it. Now I'm not going to laugh every time he stutters, you know? So anyway, that eye contact changed my life. Still stutter a lot. And real quick, I'll get to my point finally here. So when interviewing dentists through that decade, still having the good stutter going, I found an instant trust. They developed an instant trust for me. And, you know, these are almost all over the phone, these initial conversations, and I'm pushing through blocks like that, but saying what I got to say, right? We have the communication. And now it's not that I have a bad relationship with the doctors from the beginning, but they don't develop an instant trust for me like they used to, because maybe I'm just another smooth talking, you know, business owner, et cetera, right? But when I was doing that, I was human. And I'm not saying I'm not human now, but I was like, I had a problem, right? A speech challenge, but I'm saying it anyway. And I'm interviewing them, right? I'm Dr. Wilson. They're interviewing, you know, for the Wilson Dentals. And so basically, to your point, in those last 6 or 7 years of stuttering, we can actually see this as an advantage. And that's how I see it, as an advantage. Like, because it doesn't work for me to, oh, stuttering's beautiful and it's an advantage. Okay, I need to understand how, right? I'm not just going to accept something because somebody states it, right? Because that's what, you know, our times, you know, I'm not just going to believe it because 2021 people believe it. I want to understand why.
Yeah,
so,
sure.
Right. And in this sense, because if there's one thing we know, Barry, people 100 years from now will look back on us and think in some ways those people were so much less sophisticated than we are, right? However,
Which is true. Yeah,
it's always how it is.
We know less than folks will know in 100 years.
Right.
So I think that instant trust thing is really important, and it makes me think about a conversation. It was an email conversation I had with Chris Constantino and Mike Turner, two men who stutter. Chris is an SLP and a professor at Florida State. Mike is a documentary filmmaker, and both generous and kind, big-hearted guys. And the conversation we were having via email was about masculinity and stuttering. And what we were developing in the conversation was this idea that that one of the things that is giving men heart attacks at 35 years old, that's like causing men in particular to drop dead of stress, or to drink heavy, or to have high blood pressure, or to be violent, is this assumption that masculinity is defined by your ability to contain your feelings and not show them. And this is not healthy behavior, but it is so deeply embedded in the DNA of our culture, and not every culture, but certainly U.S. culture, that the very definition of manliness is about stoicism. That we have this model that we see all the time, where this rigid adherence to stoicism causes unhealthy behavior and just bad health in general. And as men who stutter, we are incapable of hiding our vulnerability. It is right out there on our sleeve. And the surprise is that it ends up advantaging us. So I used to teach high school age kids, and particularly high school age boys. And it was at a writing camp. And so a disproportionate number of the kids I taught, especially the boys I taught, were sensitive, thoughtful, kind boys who were feeling like outsiders in their world back at home because of that. And I tell them about this principle in evolutionary biology that's called antagonistic pleiotropy, which basically says that there are some traits that are good for a young organism and bad for an old one, or vice versa. So for example, a turtle spends 20 or 25 years building a shell. And during that 25 years, it's putting so much energy into building the shell that it's not reproducing itself. And so if it gets hit by a car, it's going at age 17, it's not going to pass on its genes, which disadvantages a young turtle. But once that turtle has a shell, it's invulnerable. And it can keep reproducing until it's 100 years old. And so what served it really badly as a young turtle serves it really well as an old turtle. And vice versa, a human baby in a cold climate might put on a lot of baby fat, and that advantages it during a famine period. You know, there's no food, but this baby has baby fat, and that will get it through lean times. But then that baby fat becomes adult fat, and it makes the adult more prone to heart disease. So that's something that that advantages you when you're young, and disadvantages you when you're older. And so this kind of masculine stoicism follows that model too. It really disadvantages 16-year-old boy to be sensitive and kind. And it advantages the stoic 16-year-old who can swagger around and be all macho and get props from his buddies for being all macho. But that stoic kid who's getting all the props when he's young, when he's older, he's going to have trouble finding a mate. He's going to have trouble making friends. He's going to have trouble having real intimacy that helps him weather all the hardships in life. He's more likely to be drinking. He's more likely to have heart disease. Whereas the sensitive kid is People love a sensitive man. People want a sensitive friend. People want a sensitive companion. And so because our stutters mean that we have to be somewhat emotionally transparent because our speech will betray us, that ends up advantaging us. And so Chris and I led a workshop at NSA, the National Stuttering Association, a few years ago that talked about all of this in the context of masculinity. And Chris has written about this at some length. He talks about stuttering naked, meaning stuttering in a way that exposes yourself. And he talks about how he tells stories about, like, the woman on the airplane who they weren't talking, that they were seatmates. They were next to each other on a busy airplane, and they were each in their own worlds. And then he ordered from the flight attendant and he stuttered, and she heard him stutter, and she was a Black woman, and they were able to have this really rich conversation that kind of compared her experience walking through the world as a Black American and his experience walking through the world as someone who has a disability. And they had a connection that they would not have had if he didn't stutter. And my God, I feel like all the time in my personal life, in casual conversations, in my work, people open up to me and we have real intimacy because they've heard me stutter and because they see my vulnerability, and that gives them permission to be vulnerable also.
They've also seen your courage because they're seeing your stutter because you're speaking up.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right?
Absolutely.
And, I think people really respect character. I think that's still, something that really inspires and makes people, I don't know, like you, respect you, all that kind of stuff.
And it's the courage of vulnerability, which
Right.
sounds a little contradictory at first, right?
Yeah.
But I think about all the ways that we equate hardness with courage. And this is a different model. We're equating openness, we're equating transparency, vulnerability with courage. It's a lot harder to be courageous if it's the courage that risks people rejecting you.
Showing that you're not perfect and that, you're not going to win a speed talking contest, that sort of
right.
thing.
Yeah.
I totally hear you. And I see this a lot. I now run a peer mentorship / coaching program. I don't charge anybody for it, but we meet up and we go out and we do what the guy did for me when I was a freshman at Florida State, where we have people go out and talk to people in the mall and ask them questions, and sometimes tell them that they're a person that stutters and what they're doing. And I've done, this was a big part of my journey over the last few years, was just sort of, I had never been able to make any speech technique transfer outside of the therapy room. It would always fall apart. And so I always had it in the back of my mind, well, what if I just went out and talked to everybody in the mall, like go out and speak with 100 people? Like, would it transfer if I sort of was that assertive about, making it transfer, sort of thing? And so through me doing it and through seeing lots of others do it, there are so many contacts, as I like to call them, where you tell people, excuse me, ma'am, I have a stutter. And I also have them use, and I use sometimes pretty exaggerated deliberate disfluency. So you're showing them, please do not confuse me with a normal fluent speaker, like that sort of radical honesty, as I like to call it.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so often you get these powerful human moments with people where they're like, oh, that's so cool, and you tell them you're on a program with other people that stutter and we're out facing our fears together, another person's on the Zoom call over in the UK and I'm here in LA, I'm in my case, I'm in Syracuse, New York, but people are all over. And people think it's cool. And then they'll start telling you about their deepest, darkest.
Yeah.
Like one lady started telling me one time about how she's got a big secret that's in the closet or in the room in her case. So she's a very successful psychiatrist in Brooklyn, and she's got a nice, 3-bedroom, sweet place. She's got a secret though, that one of the rooms is a disaster. Like it's piled up. She hasn't touched it in years. There's cobwebs that thick. There's crap. And she won't have people over to her house because of fear that they'll discover that she's a weirdo that has a room like that. Now she's like, look, Mike, I'm a trained psychiatrist. I know I can just clean the room up, but I'm not doing it. And it embarrasses me, so people have different stuff in the closet, right? Whether it's, homosexuality for, much of human history, right? Most men for most of history, I think, in most cultures felt like they had to be in the closet.
Yeah.
I think, right?
Well, and I think actually still, but yes.
Well, and so I like, a lot of people use the term disclosure for telling people that we stutter, which I understand. That's the term they use in speech therapy. But for me, when I think of a disclosure, it's like something bad. Oh, I'm disclosing something bad. Anyway, that's fine to use that term. That's what people use, but I like to call it. I think it's more accurate to call it coming out of the closet.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. I also like the term radical honesty. Back in the 90s, I co-founded this informal network of LGBTQ people who stutter. And one of the things that we did was we brought some of the language that we developed in our, gay and lesbian communities and brought that language into the stuttering world. And we noticed that by the late 90s, people were starting to use the language of the closet and of coming out and of passing, all stuff borrowed from the gay and lesbian world. And I think a lot of those parallels are very, once you think about them, they make a lot of sense. Mm-hmm. That if you're an ethnic or a racial minority, if you're Black, if you're Jewish, if you're Latino, you grow up in a family of people who share your experience. Often you grow up in a community of people who share your experience. You might go to a place of worship that is all people who look like you and believe in the same God. But if you are different by dint of physical disability or other disability or sexual orientation or gender identity, then you're often going at it alone, and you're really kind of inventing things as you go along. You're looking for chosen family. You're looking to build community that is not geographic. And you're also dealing with a lot of misinformation, even among people who are close to you, and particularly people who think that you've got a problem that needs a cure. I mean, it's only been recently that we've really seen a rejection of reparative therapy to cure homosexuality. Uh, and so likewise, I think that some of the conversations that were happening in the gay community about cure, and have been happening in other disability communities like the deaf community, and increasingly the autistic community, with the conversations about neurodiversity, are shifting away the model from cure to embrace. And again, the 20th century version of this was, we are just as good as everyone else, or this is not a barrier to success. And now the language is much more about, this is actually something that can help us in our lives. This is something that can help society because of our presence there. That the world would not be better if everyone talked fluently, if everybody heard in the same way, if everybody's brain was organized in the same way, if everybody was straight or cisgender. That at both the individual and at the social level, having diversity, not just of race, but of how our bodies and our minds work, only makes us stronger.
Absolutely. And I think that's huge, that richness of diversity, because life is boring when everybody's, exactly. I mean, it can still be fun, but it's not as good, I think, if everybody's the same, and I remember thinking that in dental school at NYU, because where I had lived in Atlanta and Tallahassee, Florida, and out in the mountains in Colorado, everybody almost that I met had, the example that sticks in my head, the only difference between many of us is that one person's high school was named the Tigers and another one was the Lions, right? But in dental school, I'm meeting people that grew up in the Middle East, grew up in Asia, grew up in Latin America, Eastern Europe, and I realized just how cool that was. Obviously New York City is, I don't know, arguably it might be the most diverse place in the world, perhaps, as far as a large number of a lot of different groups. Maybe London, I would assume, is up there, but most places aren't near as diverse as that. And it was really cool, and then you add, like you said, on top of the ethnic diversity, racial diversity, some people hear differently, some people speak differently, some people, whatever, are short or tall, or, the whole variety. And that's really, if you're paying attention, it makes life a lot more interesting when that's around you.
Absolutely.
Right. So Barry, we're almost at the end here. We've been talking, for like an hour, and that seems to be a good length for these episodes. But something that I had wanted to ask you about, I thought it would have come up earlier, but we've been just sort of flowing from one thing to the next here. But something I heard you say in another interview on YouTube was that there's a big difference, or people that stutter, and probably others as well, but in this context, people that stutter sometimes will confuse a job for a career. In other words, one job that they try to get, there might be some, discrimination, or somebody's like, oh, I'm not gonna hire you because you're stutter, but don't confuse that with that career. You can still go after that career. And just because one door, maybe two doors, maybe five doors, God forbid, are not open, if you keep going after it, you can often find your way into that career anyway.
Oh yeah, I don't remember when I said that, but I do believe that to be true. And it kind of goes back to something you were saying earlier about the moment where you recognize that people in your lives who reject you, it's like, all right, don't let the door hit you on your way out. I think that's also true professionally. I mean, here's an example. I was very fortunate in my first job after college. I was hired by a guy named James Edmonds, and this was in Lafayette, Louisiana, who actually, when he heard me stutter on the phone, he wanted me more as a reporter at his newspaper, because he thought, I just read this guy's newspaper clips. They're really good. He's 21 years old. And I thought they were good under normal circumstances. But now, knowing that he reported these stories with a stutter, that makes me want him even more. And that was great. And I got this first job. And then I started thinking about what's the next step in my career. And I remember I applied for this job in Rhode Island, and the editor calls me, or the publisher, I can't remember, and like, he's ready to hire me on the spot. He's read my stuff. I matched the profile he's looking for, and he's all full of enthusiasm. There was nothing but enthusiasm. And we get off the phone with this plan for a follow-up. And then he calls me back the next day or 2 days later, and he says, we're not going to actually hire for this job as we originally envisioned it. I think we're actually going to do some reorganizing and think of this job differently. And I said, it's the stutter, right? And he said, yes. And then he just begins this kind of pressured speech thing where he's talking really fast, and he's saying, well, this is a job that is going to be very publicly visible, and we plan on breaking stories, and when we do, the reporter is going to be interviewed on television, and we want somebody who can talk well on television. But if you're ever in my city, I hope you'll come have beer with me, and I'll even pay for your hotel. It's like, thanks. That was profoundly discouraging. And now I can look back and think, all right, buddy, don't let the door hit you on your way out, right? The truth is that just as stuttering is a really good way of screening lovers and friends, it's also a good way of screening employers and clients. And I do not know a career that does not have a successful stutterer in it. Like I could scan medicine and academia and journalism and education and beautiful carpentry and public speaking careers and acting and okay, maybe I don't know someone who stutters who's an air traffic controller. But all right,
It's funny that you mentioned air traffic controller, because that's my one example I give. Okay, maybe not air traffic controller, but pretty much everything else.
Pretty much everything else, yeah. And virtually any career that you choose, you can find role models, you can find mentors. I cannot remember the last time I lost an opportunity because of my stutter. I've been teaching at 2 great universities. I turned away an opportunity to 3rd. I didn't apply for any of those jobs. These were people who came to me because they knew my reputation as a journalist, and they wanted me teaching journalism. I do almost all of my interviewing these days in ways that are recorded, so I can transcribe the interview. So either I'll interview someone on Zoom, or I will interview them in person, and I'll record it. And I am forever cleaning up transcripts, and so I'm listening to myself a lot. And I stutter a lot when I interview people, and I stutter a lot when I teach. And I do not get the kind of rejection that I might expect in a high talking kind of career. I just don't. Now, like you, like every stutterer I know, we get weird reactions from people who don't know that we stutter. You call somebody to make a reservation, you walk into, you know, a takeout restaurant, and somebody who doesn't know what to expect flinches, or they laugh nervously, or they say something offensive. And I know that I've met people who stutter, and I didn't know that they stutter, and I've interrupted them. And I know that I've seen people who have disabilities that I don't have a lot of experience with, and I've maybe acted awkward or uncomfortable. And because I think about this stuff a lot, I'm pretty good at the quick recovery, but I know that I have human reactions. Why wouldn't other people have human reactions?
Right. And
But
the forgiveness, I mean, on some level is so
yeah,
important here, right? It's like, no, they're not perfect. We're not perfect. Nobody's perfect. You
yeah,
know, once they figure out what's going on, which hopefully is pretty quick. And if they don't figure it out for a long time, then there may be, not, not as in, not that intelligent, because most people can figure it out
yeah,
pretty quickly, right? Especially, when you have an overt stutter. And I think, forgiving people, the old thing, forgive them, they know not what they do, right?
yeah. And also thinking of it as a teachable moment. It's like, okay, I've been stuttering for half a century, more than half a century. Um, they're not going to hurt me, but if I can educate them so that when they encounter a 14-year-old who stutters, they're not going to say something that hurts the 14-year-old, then I've done a good deed. But to bring it back to career, by and large, it is not an impediment. And I also know that I'm speaking from some privilege here, because my stutter is not as severe as it used to be. And that somebody who aspires to a high communication career, who has a more severe stutter than me, is going to have a rougher time. That said, I know journalists and educators with much more severe stutters than mine, who do great, and who might require more patience, but that builds more intimacy. And in some ways, they have an advantage over me, just like you your old self as a more pronounced stutterer had some advantages over your new golden tongued dentist self. And so I would hope that anybody who is considering a career that they are worried about, seek out the people who are doing it, seek out the mentors, talk to folks, use their success as your inspiration.
Absolutely. Seeing mentors is so important, right? Whatever the walk of life, seeing others that have done it, and therefore knowing it's possible is so valuable. And I think the pandemic, has been huge for giving people just unlimited, almost unlimited folks that stutter opportunity to speak with folks that stutter. I mean, I think
Yeah,
before the pandemic, it was Stutter Social, I think is virtually all there was as far as online chat places for folks that stutter. So if you lived in Utah or in Hawaii, neither of which last time I checked had an NSA chapter, who are you getting together with that stutters, right? But now that it's gone online, I mean, these things are not going to go the way of the dinosaur if there even is an after the pandemic. I don't know what's going on there, but I think these things are here to stay. And I think the pandemic, for people that stutter, for stuttering support, probably forever, the pandemic has been a beautiful thing for folks that stutter.
I agree.
It's pretty, and as you said, getting together, just that getting together. Like you said, the stuff that happens outside, like the official events at a conference, are great, but it's just the people that stutter hanging out, right? That's so powerful. And so any way you can get people together, although obviously the gold standard is in person, but even over Zoom, just realizing that there's other folks out there that are like us, right? You're not in a tribe of one,
Right. Right.
right? You're
Right.
totally not, which is pretty awesome. So Barry, it's been great talking to you. Any last thoughts? So if there's a 10-year-old, let's say watching this, next week or 20 years from now, if you could talk to your 10-year-old self, you know, what would you pass on?
You are at the worst age, and it gets better. It gets better. You will outgrow your awkward body. You will make more friends. You will soon reach an age where people appreciate you for being upfront about who you are, and if you can hold on for the next couple of years and be your best, kindest, most loving self, what you'll find is that there's a whole world of people who are going to love you back.
Well said. And it's not an impenetrable wall to live in a great life,
It's not.
Really not.
It's not.
Barry, it's been awesome speaking with you. Thank you very much for joining me. I think, people are going to get a lot out of what you shared, and keep doing what you're doing, man.
This has been a great pleasure, Mike. Thank you.
So, take care. Bye.